Welcome to the museum. Welcome to the African Meeting House. I'm the president of the Museum of African American History, Marita Rivero, and it's always just such a pleasure to see you here and have your laughter and your voices sink right and seep right into the wood. Someone asked me how long this has been here. It's been here since 1806. And we tell people that this is the black community of the 1700s and 1800s. It was small. It started about 500 people who had moved up from the north end of Boston and remained here through the 1700s, the 1800s, and then started moving off Beacon Hill to other parts of Boston. That community exchanged for some small amount of money, I think a buck, this meeting house with a Jewish community, and it became a synagogue. So it was a synagogue throughout from in the 1900s through about 1960. And that allowed really the caretaking of this building to continue. And finally that community moved, and it remained empty for maybe 3 years, 4 years, and was discovered by an amateur historian who said, wait a minute, that's not a wreck, that's the African Meeting House. And she began that process of pulling people together from the community to eventually form a 501c3 and to become what we've become today. So we had a second restoration of this building and reopened it in 2011. We took it back to 1855 because we had pictures. The camera was around in the mid-1800s. Took it back. So I tell people that the back pew is the one that's original. It's got a smaller bench, more upright back, a little difficult to sit in. We tell people the floors here are older than the building. Old West, and another close here in Boston, was being rebuilt after a fire. And they said, you guys are building the meeting house, you need some wood. So these are colonial floors. But I say, if you knew nothing about this community around us, these were entrepreneurs. They started as a group of enslaved people, of course, but Massachusetts ended that practice at the end of the 1700s, early. And so it became a community of mainly free people. Many lawyers, people who trained, came to Boston, lawyers, doctors, nurses, other medical professionals. People who owned stores. They were tailors, they were dressmakers, they were caterers. So they were making money. Somebody ran a gaming establishment right around the corner, and he used that money to pay the salaries for the black regiment, the 54th Civil War Regiment. So our museum is really engaged in the process of stewarding these buildings and of telling these stories because they're so relevant often to what we're doing now. It's a cultural continuum. And we love being involved with authors. We love being involved with scholars. We love being involved with people who are fellow storytellers, journalists. We appreciate you. We're so happy to be able to bring this award forward. I can't tell you how much pleasure it gives us to know that we're exposing this side of the museum's work. You know, the research, the engagement with learning, and with people who are in that business. I think the next thing I should probably do is thank the people who for 50 years kept the museum going. I say it's often like a relay race. People just stepped in and took a leg. They took their leg, ran their leg, and more people showed up and took the next leg. And that's how we actually grew to this time. So the chair of our board is in the building, and so are members of our board and former members of our board. I want to thank you for that and for your work in the community to really keep this place growing and thriving. We have members of our staff here. They're the people who are, dawn to dusk doing what they have to do to keep the place moving, and I thank you. So you're now part of the community. Come back. Come back and join us again. I hope you'll look at our website. You'll see all kinds of events that are coming up this fall. And I hope you'll be part of us. And I'll talk more about that at the end of the end of the program. And next door, of course, is a school. People started educating children in their homes. They called it Africa School. They left African school when they built this building and then educated their children on the bottom floor. But that wasn't enough room. So finally, they were able to build a building across the street and outgrew that and fought the separate but equal fight so that their children in Massachusetts could go to any public school. They were taxpayers. So we follow that route of the petitioning and the work we've done in legislature and the political arena to really build a whole community. And we hope we're able to reflect that back at people as they come together to think about the America we want today. We would not have been able to put together a book award had it not been for Kathy and Jim Stone. Yeah. Thank you. So, you really need people who have vision and who are able to see us. Kathy Stone herself was on the board and chaired our board. She and her husband, Jim, really looked at the museum and thought about what it might need and came around with this idea. So I thank both of them. Sonia Plessette is on their staff. I just met other staff people, and they've been terrific to work with on this venture. Pam Waterman, of course, is the administrator. So I'm going to ask Kathy to step up and say a few words as we launch into tonight's program. Thank you.
Thank you so much for being here to celebrate the second annual Museum of African American History Stone Book Prize. I do need to thank Marita and her staff at the museum, the jurors, the authors, the publishers, and others, but I too want to recognize by name and have her take a bow, is Pam Waterman, who is the director. Pam, we are deeply grateful for your wonderful and excellent work in bringing this prize to life. The books we celebrate this evening and all the books submitted for the prize document important people, events, and times in American history. I believe it's only through continuously examining our shared history that we can fully understand our past and chart a more informed and inclusive course for the future. The award celebrates scholarship and the incredibly important work of all those who dedicate themselves to a study of the past. But it also celebrates the history of the successful abolitionist movement, which began right where you are sitting now, and took to the world the values that I believe are the true American values, and to which I hope we return. Thank you, that's all. I just wanted to say I hope you enjoy the evening.
Good evening. My name is Lee Rayford. I am an associate professor of African American and African Diaspora Studies at the University of California, Berkeley. I am, yay, go Bears, okay. I am the rookie member of this committee of jurors for the second Stone Book Prize. I'm very grateful to have been shepherded through this process by my esteemed colleagues Jarvis Givens, Assistant Professor of Education at Harvard University and the Radcliffe Institute for Advanced Study, and Dana Williams, Professor and Chair of English at Howard University. Of course, along with the guidance and support of Pam Waterman, Helen Bronk, and the Museum of African American History, the staff here. Unfortunately, Professor Williams is unable to attend tonight's event, but she sends her best to all of you who have joined us this evening, and especially this year's award recipients. Before we discuss the winner of the Stone Book Prize, we want to recognize the achievements of the two finalists. Collectively, our committee of three read approximately 6 books covering We're professors, that's why we get paid the big bucks. But they covered a wide range of themes in African American history and culture. Some books focused on a single event or city, or moment in time, while others traced experiences across centuries. Some told unknown or little-known stories or shared their own individual intellectual and political journeys. Others challenged prevailing interpretations of Black life and culture. Some books addressed pressing concerns of our contemporary moment, including the struggle for equity in education and fuller inclusion of Black women, queer, and gender nonconforming narratives into the stories we tell of Black life. Other books traveled back to the Revolutionary War era, to the world of Frederick Douglass, to the era of this country's first Reconstruction in the 1860s and 70s, and to its second in the 1960s. To guide our reading, we considered criteria including originality, significance of the subject, literary quality and excellence in craft, analytical framing and argumentation, depth of research and use of evidence, the scale and scope of the work, and the author's willingness to take intellectual risks. And I should also add, these are books that we couldn't put down. My own research focuses on Black art and photography. And to my personal delight, there were a number of compelling books that explored African-American visual culture. An American Odyssey, the life and work of Romare Bearden by Mary Schmidt Campbell, rose to the top of our list. In this beautifully written, rigorously researched, and richly illustrated book, Professor Campbell has given one of our greatest American artists the intellectual biography he deserves. American Odyssey, published by Oxford University Press, takes us on Bearden's journey across the 20th century through the artist's upbringing as the beloved child of a family of race men and race women in North Carolina, Pittsburgh, and ultimately his forever home, Harlem. Through his early career as a cartoonist, a Depression-era social realist painter, an abstract expressionist in the post-World War II period, to his arrival and beyond during the Civil Rights Movement at what would become his signature style: magnificent collages that refuse a flattened or singular Black identity. In Professor Campbell's deft telling, then, Bearden's story is intimately tied to the transformations of race and American visual politics. What are the stakes of visually representing Black people and Black life in a society forged in anti-Blackness? What are the rights and responsibilities of Black artists? How is freedom found at once on the canvas and in the street? Through the recounting of Bearden's persistent search for a new visual language to express the expansiveness of Black life, American Odyssey offers us a masterclass in the exploding field of Black art history and visual culture studies. Currently the president of Spelman College, where among other initiatives she has created Spelman's first curatorial studies program, Professor Campbell served as curator and executive director of the Studio Museum in Harlem, where she first met Romare Bearden in the 1970s. She later served as New York City's Commissioner of Cultural Affairs and Dean of Tisch School of the Arts at New York University. She has brought all of this, the caretaking mission of the curator, the institution and community building work of the arts and education administrator, the supple, close readings and exhaustive research of the art historian, not to mention the magic of a great storyteller. All of this to bear on what is a gift of a book. Please join me in congratulating and welcoming to the stage Professor Mary Schmidt Campbell.
Thank you so much, Dr. Rayford. She was my neighbor. She didn't remember it because I am so old. She was so young. She forgot that I lived around the corner from her. But that was really quite extraordinary. Marita, thank you so much for your leadership. And thank you for reminding us of the story that this structure represents. This is an unbelievably beautiful building. It's full of light and a sense of possibility. And thank you for reminding of what that can accomplish. And Mr. and Mrs. Stone, thank you. This is a wonderful way to celebrate our history and our sense of community. When the great Toni Morrison passed away, I think all of us made a mad dash to all of her works and reread her essays and her novels. And one interview that I picked up was an interview she did with Paul Gilroy. And in it, she spoke of her desire to, quote, develop a way of writing that was irrevocably Black, something intrinsic, indigenous, something in the way it was put together, the sentences, the structure, texture, and tone. Reading Toni Morrison's words made me think about the work of Rumri Bearden, because like Morrison, to enter his world is to enter the consciousness of a people, not just the consciousness of an individual artist. There's something about the way he put it together, something about the way he took fragments and brought them together, layered them, and plunged us into the tiniest intimacies and then yanked us back and connected us to the entire world. Like Morrison, looking at Bearden's collage is to be inside of time, to feel time pass, to feel the time of day, the change of seasons, the texture and tone of historic time. So when I sat down to write the story of his life, I couldn't be just an art historian. I had to learn some different things. I had to learn history and politics and social science and psychology. And when Bearden later became intensely collaborative late in his career, I needed to learn cinema and dance and poetry and music and theater and opera, because those are the disciplines into which his art expanded. My consciousness had to expand to encompass his art, and I wanted my readers to feel that expansion of consciousness as well. You learn a lot when you write a book. And what I learned most in the process of writing this book is that inside this personal story was the secret of our survival. And it's quite wonderful that we're here in this place that kind of marks our survival. I learned that in the 400 years that we were delivered to this country, we developed an indestructible way of inventing and reinventing ourselves as the times and the status of our citizenship required. As a result, we have become master shapeshifters, masters of American culture. And Bearden's metaphorical images remind us of the global reach and genesis of that mastery. One last thing. Everybody says writing is solitary, and yes, it is. But pulling together a book is not. It takes a small army. And I want to thank my colleagues at New York University, at Spelman College, my friends, my family, my cousin is here, Dr. Sheila Nutt, who helped me compile this book. And there are three people in particular. My research assistant, her name is Clara Politai. She stayed with me during the entire journey, and it was many years. My editor at Oxford, Tim Bent, who was exacting. I resisted. I'm glad he won. And my husband of 51 years, Dr. George Campbell Jr., my toughest critic and most faithful supporter. I'm especially grateful to the Museum of African American History, the Stone Book Award, the jurors, and my congratulations to the winner, Julia Scott. I look forward to reading your book, and to my fellow finalist, Kelly Carter Jackson, whom I feel as though I know really well now, because we spent, a good 30 minutes speaking, right? But it's an honor to be in your company. Thank you.
Good evening. My name is Jarvis Givens, and I'm an assistant professor of education and an affiliate faculty in the Department of African and African American Studies at Harvard University, as well as the Suzanne Young Murray Assistant Professor at the Radcliffe Institute. And so, as one of the jurors for the Stone Book Award, I have the great pleasure of sharing a bit about Dr. Kelly Carter Jackson's book, Force and Freedom, Black Abolitionists and the Politics of Violence, which was a runner-up for this year's prize. Carter Jackson is the Knopfel Assistant Professor of Humanities and Assistant Professor of Africana Studies at Wellesley College, and she has written an important book about a perennial conflict in Black social and political life. She carefully explores how Black abolitionists grappled with the question of what role violence should and must play in their ongoing struggle for freedom. In doing so, she opens up the interior world of these activists. The book helps us understand how privileging the performance of nonviolence and denying the utility of violence as the great accelerator in American emancipation actually defames the political history of African Americans. Professor Carter Jackson's introduction of what she calls political violence demonstrates how, similar to enslaved insurrectionists, some abolitionists contemplated and resorted to strategic uses of violence to advance a political agenda. Fugitive slaves believed that the use of violence was righteous when used to protect their freedom. They understood this to be similar to the revolutionaries fighting for American independence. Black abolitionists believed that self-defense and collective defense was morally and biblically justified. Again and again, Professor Carter Jackson reveals that when faced with violent opposition in their pursuit of freedom, quote, Black women refused to play the role of damsel in distress, end quote. I like that line in the book. And Black men did away with attempts at moral suasion. Yet overwhelmingly depictions to the contrary continue to dominate academic and public discourse. When reading Professor Carter Jackson's book, one hears the echoes from the Black intellectual tradition of the past in anticipation of force and freedom. I was reminded of Carter G. Woodson publicly writing to Black teachers and students in 1938, insisting that despite popular portrayals, quote, the abolition movement was not a movement by others for the Negro, and the Negroes from the very beginning were the first abolitionists, end quote. Just a few years before this, historian Lawrence Reddick surveyed all the adopted history textbooks in the South and noted the absence of Black abolitionists. Around this same time, the visual artist Lois Mailou Jones sketched a portrait of Harriet Tubman at the request of Woodson that it could be circulated for Negro History Week. In the portrait, Tubman's shotgun is prominently positioned and nearly the length of her body. This is all to say, one of the beautiful things about Force and Freedom is that it responds to an invitation by Black intellectuals and artists for at least nearly a century to take seriously the radical imaginations of Black abolitionists, to place them at the center and to engage their political ideals on their own terms. To appreciate their bold assertions of Black humanity demands an accounting of how violence was used to advance the work of freedom. As this work reminds us, censoring our recollections of Black abolitionists and their expansive political imaginations is both intellectually dishonest and a distortion of their legacy. Please join me in celebrating Kelly Carter Jackson for her rich and powerfully written book, Force and Freedom.
Wow. Just have to get my bearings a little bit. I never win anything, not even raffle tickets. So it's a lot for me. I'm honored to be a finalist for the Stone Book Award Prize. I would like to thank James and Kathleen Stone of the Stone Foundation and their generous award, the Museum of African American History, the jurors who read dozens of books. I must admit, when I looked at the list of almost 60 books, I thought, I don't have a chance. I really thought that. And I also thought I read about violence, so I also didn't think it was gonna get a lot of love. But I've been surprised to see, just pleasantly surprised to see how people have responded to the book. I'm also incredibly honored to be on the same place and platform as Julia Scott. You're all in my footnotes, and so, and in my dissertation. And it's such an honor to cite someone over and over again, and then to see yourself in your book next to theirs is just, I'm beyond humbled and honored. So thank you so much for your contribution. And to Mary Schmidt-Campbell, the president of Spelman College, as a graduate of a HBCU, like, I'm in awe just sitting next to you. I'm so grateful to be here. It is not lost on me that I'm standing at the very podium that so many abolitionists stood and spoke out against the evils of slavery. I find it incredibly poetic to be standing here with a book that honors their activism. They risked their lives and their freedom so that I could be here. And I want to thank the abolitionists and all those who fight to ensure that Black lives matter. I would also like to thank my president, Paula Johnson, who has always been so supportive of me. This gratitude extends to my provost, Annie Shinnon, my chair, Layli Mapignon, my former chair, Philomena Study, and my awesome colleagues in the Department of Africana Studies at Wellesley College. I want to thank my editor, Bob Lockhart. Bob believed in this book and supported me, even when I told him I wanted a gun for the cover. Bob believed in this book, and he never took the force out of my writing, and for that, I'm so grateful. To everyone at UPenn Press, I hope this is a shared success, and it's definitely a shared labor. I have a host of friends, family, mentors that are too numerous to list here. You are all remaining in my heart and in my book's acknowledgments, where I have a much more expansive list. But I do want to thank my parents, Bill and Novella Carter, who planted the seeds of scholarship within me. I want to thank my husband, who is my biggest fan and partner in life, Nathaniel Jackson. I'd also like to thank Michelle Harding and Shalon Prasad. They've been caregivers for my children, and I know we say it takes a village to raise a child, but it really takes a village to write a book. And I have 2 young children who are at home, William, who is 5, Josephine, who is 2.5, and 1 on the way. And when I tell you it is not easy, writing and rearing children, shout out to all of my caregivers. Finally, I'd like to say thank you to my Lord and Savior, Jesus Christ, for whom all things are possible. If you know me, you know that I'm always talking about doing the Lord's work. I believe in justice for the oppressed. I believe in giving voice, volume, and value to the marginalized. I believe in freedoms won over freedoms given. To everyone who made it out tonight and is striving for liberation and truth, I say, may the force be with you. Thank you.
All right. So we now have the great honor to introduce the winner of this year's Stone Book Award. Julius S. Scott's book, The Common Wind, Afro-American Currents in the Age of the Haitian Revolution, quickly rose to the top during our deliberations. We were struck by the methodological rigor, the beauty of the prose, but also the political and intellectual significance of the book's intervention. Scott provides striking evidence of complex systems of communication within the Atlantic world that were hidden in plain sight. Circulating through these channels were rumors of news about rebellion and freedom, which breathed life into the freedom dreams of Afro-America across colonies and linguistic boundaries during the era of the Haitian Revolution. The book demands a new way of thinking about how enslaved Africans strived to transform their conditions in the Atlantic world. Black revolts and uprisings during slavery were not scattered, isolated endeavors. When we look through the refined aperture presented in The Common Wind, we see how ships, ports, and the channels of commerce used to oppress Black people were turned on their heads, forming webs of communication that were appropriated to facilitate coordinated acts of war and rebellion. Julius Scott forces us to see enslaved people as political actors in profound and new ways. Historians have previously benefited from Professor Scott's revelations by engaging his 1986 dissertation from Duke University, which until this book had not been published. Ironically, the way scholars came to take up this work was a sort of undercommons in its own right. But this having been said, it is critical that the public engage with this knowledge, not just academics. This is particularly the case given the heated public discourse around matters of Black internationalism. In particular, the social media organizing around American descendants of slaves, referred to as ADOS. This is to say, the common wind is a necessary resource for critically thinking through both relation and difference in Black political life in the Americas.
In our deliberations, we took time to discuss the importance of what my late colleague, Dr. Veve Clark, called diaspora literacy to Professor Scott's project. And by diaspora literacy, we mean Dr. Scott's ability to read and think across different linguistic and cultural contexts and Black diasporic experiences in constructing this book. This meant first literally reading and thinking across historical sources in different languages of power in the Atlantic world: English, French, Spanish. And what's more, it required an ability to resuscitate and engage meaningfully with the voices of Black people and other masterless fugitives from the growing slaveocracy, often buried in formal records during the 18th and 19th century. In doing so, the Common Wind recognizes the insistence of the book's subjects that their subjugation is not a foregone conclusion, that freedom dreams are persistent and articulated in many languages and through multiple acts, both large and small. Professor Scott offers the stories of resistance and refusal of Joe Anderson of Bermuda, Vincent Oge of San Domingue, Jose Caridad Gonzalez of Venezuela, musicians Doris and John of Ireland and Quebec, respectively, and so many others, are made all the more palpable through their circulation. The Common Wind reminds us that in dark times, we must cultivate a sense of the possible. We are so excited to be part of the chorus in celebrating this wonderful work of masterful reconstruction. It is a model of academic scholarship that represents the best in the field of African American history and culture. It is both corrective of so many flattened narratives about Black political life during slavery, and at the same time, beautifully descriptive of a world of knowledge and political activity that would be left buried if not for the custodial work of a diligent scholar, with both imagination and belief in the political agency of Black peoples. Please join us in congratulating Professor Julius S. Scott as the 2019 winner of the Museum of African American History's Stone Book Award.
Thank you so much for being here. We've had a great couple of days here. I've been able to meet the Stone family, been able to meet a lot of other important people, jurists that were part of electing my book as being the prize winner, for which I'm very proud and very happy, as well as old friends, new friends, all kinds of people. Thank you all so much for being a part of this celebration, and including me as part of this celebration as well. It's been a great thing for me. I'm not sure I have much to add to the wonderful descriptions of my book that just got shared with you. But I'll make a feeble attempt to at least try to talk about this a little bit, and perhaps and hopefully we'll get a chance during the question and answer section to get a little bit more into the ways in which these prizes and these things work. And I want to share with you today just one document from the time that I really began doing the research on this project. And it has to do with a series of runaway slave advertisements that I was reading in a magazine, a newspaper called the Kingston Daily Journal from Kingston, Jamaica. And I hadn't been through it very far. I was still in January sometime when I ran across the story of an individual named Tom King. And Tom King had deserted his owner in November of 1790. And the owner put an ad in the paper hoping to recover Tom King. And what he said about him really struck me as being really important and really key to my understanding of King and of the things that he represented. The things that the owner said were, Tom King is well known in this town meaning Kingston. Kingston's the current capital of Jamaica. Well known as well in Spanish Town. That used to be the capital of Jamaica, as well as Port Royal. When Port Royal was destroyed, Spanish Town became the capital of Jamaica. So it really struck me that here was an individual who had a kind of important encapsulation of all kinds of history. He was connected to all three of these capitals at different times in Jamaica's history. And I began thinking, Tom King, he's kind of a pioneer urbanite. Somebody who is part of the city. No wonder he was a runaway slave. He'd been a part of this. He'd been a part of the opposition to slavery that was really a part of what took place in cities like Kingston, like Spanish Town, like Port Royal. The thing was, I just hadn't read far enough in the runaway slave ad that his owner put in. Because in the next sentence, he totally changed my understanding about Tom King. Because he said, King left me in November of 1790, and as a person who had spent time at sea, he may attempt to pass for a free man. Now, all of a sudden, here's a whole other dimension of King that I really hadn't been aware of before, that he hadn't mentioned before. Now, we weren't talking about him spending time in cities anymore, driving nails or stuff. We were talking about him being on boats, being on ships, being on multiple ships, and that having something to do with the way he was explaining it, had something to do with the fact that King might think of himself as a free man, partly not because he spent time in Kingston and Spanish Town, but because he spent time on boats. He spent time on ships. And I had to really rethink this. It was the first time, really, that this had been presented to me as something to really think about and as being a kind of an important issue that had to kind of be explained. That is, what was it about being at sea that King's owner was explaining to us had to do with the kind of person that Tom King became? And that really became part of the beginnings of what ended up being the common wind. In other words, part of what I really hoped to find out and to think about and to express were the ways in which the movement of ships and sailors, ships and people on ships, those things moved not only to circulate networks of opposition to slavery, but also the ways in which these movements had the larger function of helping to spread news and information throughout the greater Caribbean region, and that really became part of what I wanted to talk about and study. I have a couple of things here that I wanted to read. Where are my glasses? Don't have much more, I promise. First question was, what was the connection between freedom, the opposite of slavery, and the sea? Those were the things that really played at the edges of my consciousness. And part of what I learned from Tom King, I had also learned from other people already. So I had read the autobiography of Gustavus Vasa, a person who's sometimes known to us as Olaudah Equiano, who wrote his autobiography and was published in 1789, actually the year before Tom King escaped in 1790. In the same spirit as King's owner, many slaveholding whites in the 18th century Caribbean commonly observed that, quote, "It was a very dangerous thing for a Negro to know navigation." In other words, it was part of the same dimension of what was in Tom King's mind and in Tom King's owner's mind, and it began to see some of the same kinds of things in other works of people who spent time as sailors. Equiano, a slave who became a sailor in the 1760s and 1770s, really felt and talked about the ways that his mobile occupation as a sailor really had a lot to do with the kind of person he became. And part of what he said in this really wonderful slave narrative that he wrote was that one of the things about being a sailor was he didn't hesitate, unlike what he thought other slaves might do who worked on plantations, didn't hesitate to tell my owner what was on my mind. In other words, part of what was true in Equiano's case was that he could step forward as an individual and share with his owner things that other slaves couldn't share with their owners, or wouldn't share with their owners, or were too smart to share with their owners. Whites often associated or accused non-plantation and skilled African-American workers like Equiano with insolence. That's the word they used. But slaves who had looked to the sea for their employment or escape, and sometimes those two things were connected to each other, as they were in Tom King's case, employment and escape. Those two things connected to each other pose special problems of control that I spend time talking about in The Common Wind, as did those masterless black and brown people who arrived by ship in vessels of various sizes from foreign territories to occupy spaces in other places. Whether runaways like Tom King or sailors like Equiano, many slaves found it in their interest to orient themselves toward the sea and the worlds beyond the horizon. The movement of slaves and seamen, really key to, I think, my book and what I learned, not only offered opportunities for developing skills or escaping, but provided the medium of long-distance communication and allowed interested African Americans to begin to pick up and understand the news of various places in the larger world that they inhabited, and began to understand the dimensions of that larger world as part of understanding what it meant to exist in a particular place. Thank you. Thank you very much. Yes.
I wanted to just pick up from where you
sure. Thank you.
us right at that moment. I'm Callie Crossley. I'm a commentator and a host of a radio and TV program at WGBH. You know it as God Bless Harvard.
WGBH, that's what it means?
But, and so I'm here to ask a few questions of Dr. Scott.
Okay.
We've talked, we're going to hit a few high points, a very brief conversation so that you build on what he's just said and laying out what brought him to this work that has long been praised and long been passed around and quoted in dissertations and admired. So let's talk about what is meant in your book by master and masterless, mastered and masterless. I think those of us who understand or think about enslaved people, what we understand would be those people who would be mastered, stationary in one place. And what you talked about in your book and made clear to us is that the societies of masterless, those who are mobile, really made a difference here.
You know, there's an awful lot of opposition to slavery within these enslaved communities. And I figured that masterless was a good thing to call all kinds of people, like runaway slaves, maroons who lived in maroon societies, people who made individual escapes from slavery, people like Tom King and at a later stage, Olaudah Equiano. But even people who were not African Americans were part of this kind of masterless group of individuals. People like musicians who played in the British and French armies who were occupying these different territories, and then decided themselves to escape. Sometimes escaping into the underworld that connected them up with musicians of black and brown complexion, and really getting into things that had us begin to think about the ways in which these worlds connected with each other. And there are so many interesting stories of individuals, some of which can be found in these runaway slave advertisements. So many interesting stories about them, that masterless people became a really important part, and it was because of people that weren't really under the direct control of masters that information, news, rumors got to spread individually and in ways that were determined by people of African descent.
So let's
as
pick up
opposed to
on that,
others.
because that's the second big point of your book, which
Okay.
is that, there's some people here who can't read. There are newspapers that are being passed around, but the people in question that we're talking about didn't necessarily read those, but yet the information was getting passed around quicker than the people who wrote the newspapers. They were complaining about it. In the documentation in Dr. Scott's book, these people are complaining all the time. How do these enslaved people know this? And what you have pointed out is that there was a deep connection across all of the islands with everybody talking to each other and passing information because they were so mobile. And I'd love you to just talk about that a little bit. Take a sip of water, get yourself.
Thank you. Am I looking that bad? Wow.
No,
I'm sorry
we're
about
working you
that.
up here. We wanted to make sure you were comfortable.
You know, it's really this is really one of the more interesting things, because I think a lot of times, and I don't mean to downgrade this, but the way this worked oftentimes was that people had sheets of paper that had meaning to them, and then they spread those meanings to others. Whether or not they could read those sheets, whether or not they could read each word on them, or knew what these words meant, or knew what Paris was, or what Madrid was, or other places that were referred to in these individual places. I'm not sure that was always true. But part of what was true was there were ways in which people had to figure out ways to communicate and to spread information and news. And that's the way that sometimes that came as part of people who could really in detail read these narratives. And sometimes it meant that people in detail could not read them, but could express something about them that made them seem believable to others, and that was a part of the way these things worked. So that sometimes there was a case of people reading, sometimes it was a case of people interpreting, and sometimes it was the two of them together.
But it was
They
also
read
always a case of people passing information.
But it was always the case of
what
that.
came through to your book is, and many people of color understand this, the invisibility of folks of color, even in this scenario where they were property, where people should have been trying to pay attention.
Right.
These people are like, hey, let me tell you what's happening.
Right. No, that's
You
right.
probably don't know
That's
this
right.
is going on, and
That's
all
right.
of this
That's
is
right.
happening. There are so many fabulous documents in your
Right,
book
right.
illustrating how that went.
Right, yeah.
And it makes sense now, but nobody thought it was happening.
Right. Yeah. No. That's exactly right. And you know, somebody who steps off a ship, that contains with it a certain level of authority. He got off a ship from X place, so he must know what was going on in X place. They never tell you about what's going on in X place. It's a lot different than it is here.
Yes.
See, we got something different going on there than y'all got going on here. What y'all got going on there? Oh man, shoot. We got all, you know.
Exactly.
And who knows exactly the ways in which these things moved and spread and enabled people to try to convince people to think about the broader world and what other possibilities may exist, not only in the broader world, but in the world that they inhabited. And so that was a part of the way this
And
worked.
the number one possibility that may exist would be to be not just masterless, but to be out of the grip of slavery.
That's right.
So that's what they were passing around.
That's right.
Bits and pieces of information
That's right.
about where laws had gone away, where people were flouting them and still
That's
living
exactly
a good
right.
life, where people had escaped from jail, where folks were living all out in the street free.
Right.
So many great stories in this book. I encourage you. The stories are just fabulous of
Oh
all
yeah,
of the
yeah.
individuals
I
that
found
have done that.
some pretty nice
You found some great
information.
stuff. And one of the points you wanted to make, however, in this, because it's centered around the Haitian Revolution, because that was so central to
Right.
all of these moments of
Right. That's right.
striving toward freedom,
That's
if you
right.
will,
That's right.
was that you wanted to make sure people understood leadership and the kinds of leaders that were sprouting up.
Right,
To think
right,
about
right.
those people in this context. Would you talk about that?
And people understanding the ways in which different forms of leadership were now being expressed by people of African descent in different places, particularly in a place like Haiti, where it really hadn't been the case before that this had been true, and that was beginning to become the case, where people began seeing and understanding and believing that people of African descent could take on these roles and establish different forms of leadership that were going to become a part of the way things were moving in the future.
And if you couldn't think about a person of color being a leader, then how could they be a threat
That's
to
true.
you?
That's true.
But as the rumors are passing that people can be leaders, then the incidents and the protests just kept coming. One of the things that I wanted to ask you to address, because I was just taken with every single page and every single story of, I don't care how hard it was, how tough it was, how impossible it seemed, people kept pushing back against this enslavement in every way that they could. Now, historians are supposed to have a somewhat disparate take on all of this. You're looking for the documents to prove what you have come to understand. But I wonder, from a historian's viewpoint, and what this book has talked about in terms of the many, many ways and the many, many people who fought for freedom, if you could speak about that urge to fight against slavery. Because if anybody thought somebody was happy being enslaved, they need to reach out.
All right. Well, we really understand that was not that's a myth. That's not really that's not really the case in terms of the way things work. I just happen to find a lot of different.
But did it get to you? Because I mean, it's person after person after person, pushback after pushback. It just got to me, as you're doing that in the midst of this.
Yeah. I think it did affect me a lot. Helped me to try to think about and look at and to see different forms and possibilities of possibility for different forms of African-American radicalism that were taking place at the time.
And it can't be stomped out. It's the spirit that
and,
cannot
and
be
it can't, well, and the more they tried to stamp it out, the more it spread and the more complicated it became.
Well, The Common Wind, it's a fabulous book. It tells the story that we all need to know about.
You express it beautifully. Thank you very
well,
much.
thank you. So
I'm
did
taking
you.
you on the road. I'm taking you on the road with me.
Thank you so
Well,
much,
thank you.
Dr. Scott.
Thank you. Thank you very much.